Michael McMullan, and you're very welcome once more to the WPBSA official podcast, where this week we're turning the spotlight on Welsh snooker, and in particular on a time when Wales had probably more top players, in relation to population size anyway, than anywhere in the world. Terry Griffiths was very much at the forefront of that era, and I'm delighted to say his son Wayne is with us for this, along with Welsh former professional Neil Tomkins. And Wayne, I'd like to start with you with a very simple question. Why is it that Wales has always punched above its weight so much on the table?
Good morning, Michael. It's an interesting question. Certainly, it has punched above its weight. I think Wales is roughly around 3 million people. But over the years in snooker now, and going back to the era you talked about, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there were numerous professionals, not only strong professionals, but a lot of strong amateurs as well. So, I think a lot has to do with the people who did very well early on. I think Ray Reardon obviously winning 6 world championships through the 70s. Then Dad coming along and winning his first, which brought a lot of publicity to Wales and the snooker scene. And then the likes of Neil and lots of the other players, Mark Williams, Matthew Stevens, Dominic, all maybe riding on that wave of possibility, seeing people from like mining villages becoming multiple world champions. I'm sure that gave them a lot of interest, a lot of belief. And also I think the size of the country is very important. Speak to people in Canada, who can't get the game kicking off like they wanted to. A lot of good players, good people over there, but it's just such a vast country. Whereas in Wales, you've got the valleys, you've got Newport, Cardiff, Swansea, Llanelli, so close together. So many good players sort of concentrated in a small area, sharing things, good practice, sharing ideas. That's one of the main reasons I feel that they were so strong, and they are so strong today.
And that is the thing, Neil, isn't it, that Wayne has touched on there? Yes, there were the big stars like Terry and Ray Reardon and Doug Mountjoy who inspired the younger Welsh players. But going back much further, Neil, it's just so embedded in the Welsh culture.
It is, Michael. Yeah, good to see you all this morning. Wayne kind of talked there about the proximity, the closeness of all those communities, and wherever you went, there were snooker tables. In up the valleys, you had the kind of social working men's clubs, social clubs that had probably had 2 or 3 tables in them. Then through the 80s, you had the kind of boom of snooker clubs opening. I'm from Newport. There were 4 big snooker clubs in Newport. Same in Cardiff, same in Swansea. So everybody was playing, and it was competitive. There would be 1-2 league nights a week where it was a big deal, and players would turn up. They'd play their one frame, and even your average club player they were good. You couldn't take for granted any kind of easy result. So yeah, the sort of success that Wayne talked about there with Ray and Terry and Doug in the early days just seemed to success breeds success, right? So that pattern has kind of continued right from all the way through.
The fact that it never stops raining in Wales probably helps driving people indoors. But being from Ireland, I know all about that. And just staying with you, Neil, you mentioned Ray Reardon there. And I know you're a bit too young to really remember his heyday. But growing up in Wales and being involved in snooker culture, he was just always there, wasn't he? As this giant colossus of the Welsh game. And everyone was so aware of him and what he'd accomplished.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, Ray, Terry and Doug, they were gods. To a young kid like me growing up in Wales, they were on TV regularly, being successful, winning some of the biggest events, and they were kind of inspirational for like I say, kids like me to watch. I mean, I had the fortune to sort of play some of them as I grew older, and worked very closely with both Terry and Ray. Something that I'm kind of really privileged to have the opportunity to do, because again, when you're watching these sports on the TV, that they were the kind of main men.
You think now to all the success he had, Wayne, he won those 6 world titles. I would assume that by 1978, he was probably regarded at that time as the greatest player there had ever been. And then 1979 came along, Wayne, and everything was completely different. Suddenly, instead of this guy who'd been winning the World Championship over and over again, a complete newcomer, great amateur, but first season as a pro, goes and wins the World Championship at his first attempt. Now, how aware were you, Wayne, at that stage, being a young boy, of what your dad was achieving in 79 and what it all meant?
Yeah, I was 8 years old at the time. My memories of it were good things, obviously, being taken out of school maybe to do 1 or 2 interviews with my mum during the competition. Obviously, dad winning. I wasn't really aware of the matches as they went. I watched the final internationally with dad's brother Barry, who's no longer with us, and his wife, and I can see myself sitting in that small living room in a street close to where dad was born, actually, watching the final. So yeah, I do remember it, but not as involved in snooker then. As 8 years old, my brother was only 6, Darren. So it was really something quite surreal, really. And watching dad on the TV, we'd never done that before. He'd had an amateur career where we wouldn't have seen him on the TV. So this, like for everybody in the nation, really just shot him into the spotlight, and it was the same for us, you know.
I've seen wonderful pictures over the years, both video footage and still photographs, of when he came back home and the wonderful reception that he got. Is that something that you remember much about? And also, Wayne, as part of all that, how did it affect Terry? How did he react to the fact that he had suddenly become this huge star?
Yes, we were part of the celebration. There was a local garage in the town who, not quite an open top bus like the Champions League. I think it was the back of a Toyota van or something that we were strapped onto and taken around to Netley and up to Swiss Valley where Dad lived at the time. Yeah, a lot of people turned out. The welcome home champ sign was pinned to the front of our house. So yeah, a lot of publicity leading up to that in the town. And when he won it, of course, the town came out in force and give him a fantastic welcome home. In terms of for him, I think his feet didn't touch the ground really after that. There were a lot of tournaments, a lot of exhibition requests, and I think from memory, we hardly saw him for the next sort of 2 to 3 years. He was on the road a lot of the time, touring the country, doing a lot of exhibitions then, which are not so popular now. But back then, it was the bread and butter for the players, you know.
Obviously, if someone wins the World Championship at their first attempt, not that it's something that happens very often, you expect they'll go on and win it again, perhaps multiple times. Now, it never happened. But like everyone else of that era, Wayne, there was one reason, and one reason that stood out above all others, why perhaps some players didn't go on to achieve the success they might have done, because Steve Davis came along, replaced Reardon as at that time the greatest player ever, and was just so hard for anyone else to get past. And that applied to your dad as much as anyone. But Terry was unbelievably consistent throughout his career for the next decade or so. It was hardly ever a big event that he wasn't involved towards the end of it.
Yeah, Steve came along. Well, he was turned from 78, I think, Steve, so he was around, but he came to the fore when he beat Dad. Yeah, the first Crucible curse, as they say. He beat Dad 13-10, I think, in the first round in 1980, and that was him bursting onto the scene really. And the following year, I think he went on to win it, and he played a big part in Dad's snooker life. Really, they were quite good friends actually at the end. But Dad was chasing him a lot, as you said. He was very consistent through the 80s. There was always talk of listen to the previous podcast. Dad and Steve Davis the favorite, maybe Dad the second favorite, and that's how it seemed to be through the 80s. But it affected Dad a lot that he couldn't beat Steve maybe as much as he wanted. And I think that's what got him into changing his technique, and that's what got him in initially to understanding the technique and getting into coaching, was coaching himself to try and catch Steve.
Am I remembering correctly that he actually was Steve's best man at Steve's wedding?
I don't know that. That doesn't recall, but they were certainly close. He may well have been at the wedding. Best man, I'm not sure. They're not in my recollection.
Yeah, I think someone mentioned that may have been the case. Anyway, either way, Terry, obviously, with the wonderful success in '79, Ray Reardon with all those world titles. Neil, one Welsh player who never won the World Championship was Doug Mountjoy, but he was very much in the bracket with the other two, wasn't
he? Yeah, he was. I mean, my first memory, it's all lovely memories of '79. I was probably a little bit too young. I don't remember Terry winning it so much, but listening to Wayne now has kind of given me goosebumps. But my first memory was probably '81, and watching Doug. I remember we were going on a family holiday and flying from Bristol Airport, and I'd watched a lot of the coverage through the week to kind of see Doug get to the final. Then we were going on holiday, and I was really disappointed. But Bristol Airport used to have a bank of TVs where you could put money in. So I remember actually kind of nagging my parents to put some money into the TV to watch a bit of it before we got on the plane. And so yeah, I mean that was as close as Doug got. But again, take Davis out of the equation, he could well have landed one or two of those titles.
Yeah, it was 1981 when he got to the World Championship final for the only time, and Davis beat him to win his first title. He had actually been UK champion by then. He'd won it in 1978. But when he won it again, Neil, in 1988, it was a very different thing by then because the game had absolutely soared and exploded in popularity. And to do that at the age of 46, that's not just one of the great stories of Welsh snooker. That's just one of the great snooker stories, full stop.
Well, it was at the time. I mean, it's relatively young by
standards,
isn't it? But yeah, I mean, it was unheard of, and I mean, I don't think many people local to us or anywhere else would have given Doug too much of a chance in the final against Hendry at that point. But yeah, I mean, it was a great story, which he obviously backed up then by going on to win the next event, beating another Welshman in the final in Wayne.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little later, actually. But Wayne, I'd like to ask you about something else that happened in 1988, because that was the year your dad got to the World Championship final again. You were much older by then and very steeped in the game. So you probably have more memories of that run to the final than you do of the year he won it.
Yes, I do. I wasn't up there for the semi-final, but I can remember watching it at a friend's house following the teletext then, CFAX for those who remember that. Yeah, seeing the scores popping up there.
Isn't it? Wayne, just to interject there, that's the thing that a lot of people don't realise about that era. Nowadays, a world semi-final would just be on live all the way through. And it's funny that people think of that as the age when snooker was never off the TV. But very little of it was shown live.
That's right. I think I was watching the end on CFAX on a Saturday night, but you couldn't get to see it on the TV live, certainly. So I remember him beating Jimmy, which was not a shock, but I think probably most people fancied Jimmy to get to the final that year over Dad. But Dad came through, I can't remember, 16-12 or something. Dad was playing very well. And I did go up for the final. My mum and my brother and I did go up for that final. So yeah, I certainly remember it very well. The first two sessions, Steve, I think, went 6-2 and was dominating. And then Dad came back to 8-8. And it was in the balance, but yeah, Steve, as he did so often in those days, found another gear and went away to win. And yeah, I'm sure Dad was disappointed. That was only his second final and his last final.
Did he ever talk to you about it afterwards, Wayne? Did he have any regrets about how the match had gone?
No, I don't think Dad wasn't really one for regrets. I think everybody that knows him knew that he gave his best always on the table. So I'm sure he used to talk, and he gave me something that he wrote once about how painful losing was, almost like a physical torment when you lose and in the days after. But to be honest, I never remember that in him as a dad, and he certainly never brought that sadness or pain that he felt through defeat into the house. But yeah, he would have been disappointed, I'm sure. But no, he didn't make a big deal of it. Dad was a good winner, but he was a graceful loser as well.
Neil, something that's always stood out, I felt, for Welsh snooker around that time, and it's continued really to some extent, Wales always seemed to do well in team snooker events, because around that time, the home internationals, Wales would often be considered the strongest team, maybe not even the individual players, but collectively, Wales were always such a force. They did well in the professional team events around that time, and indeed later on, they won the Nations Cup when that came along in the late 90s. there seems to be something, Neil, that Welsh players, when they're playing for their country, seem to find something extra and form a wonderful team spirit. And maybe that's why Wales have done so well in team snooker events, both amateur and pro.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, it might come back to the close proximity. Everybody in Wales would, at whatever point in time they were playing, would kind of know each other fairly well, and there would be some sort of connection there, whether they practiced together or whether they knew somebody who practiced with each other. So yeah, I think it makes me think of the Ryder Cup. The European team over the years probably haven't necessarily been the strongest team on paper, made up of individuals, but collectively they could sort of play for each other. So I would suggest there's an element of that. I mean, the Nations Cup, Mark, Matthew, they would have been close friends at the time. So yeah, they would have had each other's backs and played for each other, rather than maybe again with football, any team sport, if you got a team of individuals, it's not necessarily going to get the results that you'd get if you get those groups playing for each other and together.
And you've touched on,
I think, going back to sorry,
go on, Wayne.
Yeah, Wayne. I think going back to a former point you mentioned, Michael, the strength in depth as well. I mean, looking back at, I think the Welsh team won it in the first 2 years in 79 and 80, and they were runners up to England in 81. And I think the strength in depth, a lot of those countries would have a sort of talisman, a great player and maybe a good second, but Wales seemed to have a good third. And if they didn't, maybe a fourth and a fifth if they needed as well. So I think the strength in depth, to add to what Neil said about that sort of culturally close community spirit that we had, that strength in depth played a big part in that as well.
I think there was one year they actually won the final of that professional team event around that era that your dad would have played in so comfortably that there was no last day. It was a 2-day final and they won it so easily. Never mind no last session. There was just no last day, which I don't think has ever happened in any other tournament. But Neil touched on something there, Wayne, that I think may be a big factor in why Wales have done so well in snooker. The fact that it's such a small place, the best players from all different parts of the country don't have to travel very far to play each other. Now, that's got to be a big help as well.
For sure. And I think Neil will remember, he mentioned some clubs in Newport, Cardiff, Swansea. There were a lot of competitions around then, local leagues, even night flyers. We used to play snooker through the night, turn up for a tournament at 10 o'clock and play till 6 in the morning. And the winner takes all sort of thing. And big events, not talking half a dozen people, a lot of people. Dad opened his club, the Matchroom in Llanelli in 1987. That was a dream of his, to open a club in his hometown. And Neil would have played in these events. There was an old brewery company called Buckley's back then who sponsored a Sunday tournament, just the best of 3 tournament, roll up on a day, pay £5 to enter, or maybe £2 then to enter, a couple of £100 maybe for the winner, or small money anyway. But the standard at that event, I'm sure Neil will go on and talk about this a little bit more, but the standard at that event, there were professionals there, Matthew Stevens, Mark Williams, Neil, Lee Walker, all the top players of the day, Tony Chappell, they would all be there. That was a Sunday afternoon, 30, 40 players together, but best of 3 matches kept you so sharp. And there was a record there in that competition. There were 3 147s made on the same day in a best of 3 snooker competition in Llanelli. I think that if that doesn't tell you how strong Welsh snooker was at that time, then nothing will.
I remember that. That was in the late 90s. There was a lot of talk about it because 147s in general were quite rare. And then when this story emerged of multiple 147s coming out, it really was a real headline grabber at the time. Well, what about you, Neil? What are your memories of playing in some of those tournaments as a young amateur?
Well, I kind of made some notes in preparation for this, and I might as well rip them up now. Wayne's just taken them all off me. But no, honestly, I mean, Griffiths on a Sunday is folklore in Welsh snooker. I think the first year it was either 89 or 90, I think, Wayne, wasn't it? And I think it probably ran for 10 or 12 years. And each year it ran for 26 weeks. So for 6 months of the year, there would be a kind of weekly pilgrimage down to Llanelli, and it was the conversation through the week. You going to Griffiths on the weekend? Yeah, see you there, blah blah blah. And it was more than just a tournament. It was it had like a family feel because it was every week the same group of players. There'd be probably, like Wayne said, 32 out of 40 or 50 players would come. And it did, like Wayne said, cut you sharp. You there were you couldn't hide. Best of three. You travel down there and you could be out within I don't know, 3/4 of an hour. And it bred so much talent. I mean, Mark, Matthew, Dominic, Lee, Anthony Davis, they were all there, and for that period, the list goes on. I think the trouble with listing players is we're no doubt going to miss out some key ones, and a lot of these were ones who were sort of seeing the professional route as an ambition, but there were also lots of players who would go there that had jobs, had no ambition to turn in professional, but they could play. I mean, sadly, we've lost one recently. Ron Jones was like the godfather of Welsh snooker, from an amateur point. As far as I'm aware, Ron never really harbored any kind of ambitions of turning professional. But I think Wayne would testify that he certainly had the game to at least give it a crack. But I think he won the Welsh Amateur title 2 years, got to 3 or 4 other finals, and was just a really, really great guy. And he's a sad loss to Welsh snooker and obviously to his close family.
Yeah, Ron actually had his big moment in the spotlight. You probably remember the World Masters, which was a one-off event played in Birmingham with all the doubles and mixed and everything as well. And Ron actually played in that because there were a lot of amateurs invited, and he got to play on the TV table. I think it was against Willie Thorne. So he did actually have his moment in the spotlight in the end, which was great. But all through that era, Wayne, we'll come back to just talking about your dad and the draw that his club was. And a lot of that was because he was such a big name. And you think of Welsh sporting stars more in the 70s, I guess, and you think of rugby, but the likes of Terry and Ray and Doug to some extent were every bit as big stars in Wales as the rugby legends. So how aware were you, Wayne, growing up, of what a massive national and indeed global celebrity to some extent your dad was?
Yeah, there were some positives and negatives to that, I guess. Growing up, Dad was away a lot. We didn't see him, which put a lot of pressure on Mum, taking care of us at home. Dad was away, earning a living while he had the chance. So that certainly was a negative side. And of course, my brother and I were in school. There were people who sort of were quite happy to know that your dad was Terry Griffiths and doing well. But there was also that negative side, maybe, of you're always known as Terry Griffiths' sons, and maybe a little bit of jealousy around, bit of bullying, that sort of thing. But I never really remember that too much. When people ask this question, generally, I can say that the positives of that, dad's fame, as it were, and he was well known in Wales and, as you say, throughout the world. The positivity always outweighed the negativity, and in Llanelli, and this is another thing with Welsh people. Yeah, they don't really care for who you are, I remember Dad once saying, a famous statement. A guy shook his hand in an exhibition, and I knew you before you were famous. He said, or I knew you before you were Terry Griffiths. People didn't really put him on a pedestal, although I think they were very proud of him, as were we as a family.
And ultimately, I guess the children of famous parents, ultimately, they just still see them as dad, and primarily that was what he was to you. And with that in mind, Wayne, I'm sure you remember this, it must have been wonderful for you to play in a father and son event. I'll jog your memory about it if you don't, because I think Dennis played in it with his son, Steve played in it with his dad. Now, Neil Foulds played in it with his dad, which was kind of a bit unfair because they were both pros at the time. But you played in it with Terry, and just what a wonderful memory to have with your dad.
I do remember it. I remember we lost, both competitive, me and Dad. I think we lost. You'd have to remind me who. I think maybe was it Pirelli Slippers who sponsored that event?
That's exactly who it was. Yeah, they were the sponsors of it. It was a big deal at the time.
Yeah, I think I got a free pair of slippers, so I'd obviously arrived, at that time. Yeah,
Every cloud, every
and
cloud.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think they
add that
give
to your
slippers
career
to.
prize money.
Yeah, indeed. I think they give a pair of slippers each to Dad's opponents as well, which is very useful because of the speed that he played at. So no, I do remember that, and as I said, I can't remember how old I was. I guess I was still in school, and
I think
I
it was
remember being
1987.
nervous.
So you would have been late
87.
teens. Yeah.
Okay, well, my one claim in fame to snooker was to pinch Dad's record to be the youngest ever town champion, as it were, 16. So I was obviously quite keen to play at that time, but I can remember being a little bit nervous at that event. I think you can imagine trying to pair up with Dad and all those big names you just mentioned. I remember it was a fun time, but yeah, can remember the pressure as well a little bit, I think.
Let's come back, Neil, to talking about the amateur game. And it's often been said that the Welsh Amateur Championship at times was in many ways the hardest event in snooker to win because, okay, it wasn't a pro event, but there was such strong quality all the way through. And of course, you had to win a lot of matches. What are your memories, Neil, of the fabled Welsh Amateur Championship?
Yeah, I mean, it was a major kind of achievement to win that. And I think just touching on what Wayne, picking up on what Wayne said there about winning, he was referring to Llanelli, but the town championship, each of the kind of regions, towns would have had their own. So, there was prestige in winning the Newport Town Championship or the Cardiff Singles or the Llanelli. So, when you combined all them, and then I had a kind of unwritten rule that anybody who lived north of the M4, so as soon as you started going up the valleys, they were proper players, and you didn't even know them. They didn't. Again, they were the ones that a lot of those didn't harbor ambitions. They just played locally, and they would come out for the Welsh Amateur Championship. So you'd kind of come across players that, because back in the day it was sort of played on a home and away basis. So you get the draw, and you'd have to travel to if you had an away fixture, you'd have to travel to where they were played. And yeah, you'd kind of come across players that maybe you'd never heard of, and then you turn up and they'd make a 50 break first shot, and you'd be like, whoa, wasn't expecting that. So yeah, it was. I mean, sheer numbers. I don't know off the top of my head what kind of numbers you used to have, but it was certainly hundreds. And that would kind of get whittled down through the season. It certainly wasn't played off in one day back then. And it was it was a big title to win.
I guess the Welsh amateur scene got drained of a lot of talent when the game went open and anyone could turn pro. And you were part of that era as well. I think you were part of the class of 92 as well. I think that was the year you made your debut. So a lot of young Welsh players came in and had a go at that time. What was that scene like at that stage? All these guys coming up from Wales to try their hand to follow in the footsteps of what had gone before.
Yeah, it was pretty mad. I mean, it was you mentioned I was class 92. I probably couldn't have picked a better time to try and make it, right?
Yeah.
But it was and Wales was representative of that, but Scotland was strong at the time, England inevitably, but then with opening up the game, kind of had talent from around the world as well. So it was an amazing time. But like you say, it probably did have a bit of a negative impact on the amateur scene, because up until that point it was really strong. And I think that there's a sort of train of thought that opening up and the sort of Blackpool days kind of killed the pro-am circuit. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, you don't know what would have happened had it not have done that. Would we never have seen O'Sullivan and Williams and Higgins and the likes of them kind of coming through if it had stayed as a closed shop? Probably in those three's case, but it did create an opportunity to get in there and kind of fly, which they obviously did. But yeah, it was. I think that was born out of the level of activity that there was at an amateur and pro-am level. Because I mean, we used to travel. We used to get in the car on a Saturday, we'd be in Leeds, Sunday we'd be in London. There'd be a tournament somewhere every weekend and through the weeks in some cases.
Well, we can't talk about Welsh snooker without mentioning the next guy I want to talk about, because he wasn't quite up there on the level of Griffiths and Reardon and Mountjoy, but he was a massive folk hero, not just in Wales, but in snooker generally. Cliff Wilson, who had been an outstanding amateur, turned pro at quite a late age with all kinds of health and eyesight problems and still made it into the top 16. So, Wayne, do you remember much about Cliff Wilson and his unique style and personality?
Yeah, Cliff was around when I was a bit younger, but with his wife, Val, Dad obviously being Welsh as well. I'm not sure we may have even gone on a holiday with the Wilson family. I certainly remember going up to their house in, I think it was Caldicot, near Newport. So yeah, Dad was quite close to Cliff, and of course, as you say, he didn't really get to those giddy heights that Doug and Dad and Ray got to. But a lot of people saw him as very talented. You know, he was an attacking player, crazy potter. You know, quite famous for not doing many century breaks. He wasn't really a break builder, but he could pot anything. So yeah, he was quite a talisman and maybe a forgotten man because of the other three guys a little bit.
Well, I'm glad we brought him back to attention then. He used to claim, of course, that he deliberately didn't make centuries because it took too much out of him. Not sure how much truth there was in that. But Neil, you mentioned...
I was the same, yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Me too. I always break down on about 10 or 15, because I can't handle the centuries.
Just a reserve.
But Neil, you talked earlier when we were mentioning Doug Mountjoy about the fact that after that UK, he went on then to play in another ranking final just a few weeks later and won that as well. Now, at that time, there were very few ranking events. Steve Davis won most of them. If he didn't, it would be someone like Stephen Hendry or whatever. So it was just amazing what he did to win those back-to-back. And a huge occasion for Welsh snooker. The fact that he played another Welshman, I think had been a bit of a protege of his, Wayne Jones, in the final.
He did, and obviously Wayne was again one of those talented players that never reached the dizzy heights of like Terry and Ray and Doug, but yeah, solid, and that was his moment in the sun, and I think it was kind of fitting that they played each other. And Wayne was from, we've talked a bit about the Valleys. He used to play at a club in Abertwysig. And I mentioned Ron Jones earlier. Ron was out of Abertwysig. Alwyn Lloyd was a multiple Welsh Amateur Champion from Abertwysig. So this one club in a really small mining village produced some real talented players. So and still does. I think they're still competing in sort of Welsh team events. And so yeah, Wayne was. He had a great week at it was the Mercantile, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So that was 1989, Wayne, and we look at what was just starting around that time. Darren Morgan had become World Amateur Champion and was now a pro. Got to the World Quarterfinals actually the following year, and then you talk about Mark Williams, Matthew Stevens, Ryan Day, who's had such a long and successful career as well. But Wayne, that flood of Welsh talent that came through round about the late 80s, early 90s. That was the legacy of the influence that your dad and Ray and Doug had.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Neil mentioned that they were seen as snooker gods in Wales. And it's just that fact that people living so close to from mining villages or towns in Wales could be multiple world champions. I guess it gave the likes of Neil, Dominic, Matthew, Mark, Ryan, Lee, all these people that came through the belief that, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. And of course, as a young player, they probably felt they were as good in some ways, in practice. But the Welsh players of old and the people Neil mentioned there, now your Ron Joneses and your Wayne Jones and Alwyn Lloyd, Terry Parsons is another name from the Valleys. So solid, as players. Ray Reardon often used to talk, his strategy was he wouldn't go for a ball unless he felt it was 100%. So the times have changed now. If you can see a ball, almost the young players are going for it. So that was a changing of the guard, but yes, built on a platform I think that those Welsh snooker legends have given them.
Neil, Mark Williams is still around now. Younger fans might not actually know what a good player Matthew was, but were you aware, Neil, when you saw those guys as kids of just how good they were, and did you look at them and say, those two are destined to be big stars?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was kind of written in the stars early on. I first came across Mark in a Welsh junior event in I don't know. I think he would have. I think I would have been about 15. Mark would have been probably 12 or 13. Never seen him before, but I think he made a 50 break. And the one thing about Mark is, as a kid, he probably looked 2 or 3 years younger than he actually was. He was tiny. He obviously shot up later on, but he probably looked 10 or 11 at this point, made a 50 odd break, and you kind of thought, wow. And I think he got to the final. And I don't think, no, he didn't win it, but he had a good run in an event where we hadn't seen him before. And from there, there was a guy called, and it's not just players in Wales. I think that there's been some big characters and big influences in the game. There's a guy called Clive Coulthard, who again sadly is no longer with us now. He had a club in a place called Bargoed, the Emporium Snooker Club.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah,
again, a real hotbed. Every day you went in there'd be 8 or 10 players capable of making century breaks and sort of just practicing against each other. And Clive quickly saw Mark's talent and kind of took him under his wing and looked after him for probably, well, right up until Mark turned professional. And he actually kind of he was a bit of a wannabe Barry Hearn at the time. Barry had his Matchroom stable, and Clive put together Q Snooker Promotions. He bought a Toyota Space Cruiser van and used to take 5, 6 of us around to tournaments. I left school and started playing up there every day, and you felt yourself quickly go from there to there. So yeah, practicing with Mark on a regular basis, you could see. I remember one evening, Mark and I stayed on one night, and the bar area in the Emporium was raised up, and Mark had 140, I think, against me. And again, like you said, like Wayne was just saying about the games changed. The games changed, and breaks, 140s. I wouldn't say they were uncommon, but they were certainly less common. And again, this 13, 14-year-old kid who looked 11 or 12 making 140 break, the whole bar, which was kind of jumping, just went silent, and there was a big glass kind of viewing area, and everybody just watched it. And the next day, I think that there was a film crew in there from BBC and ITV talking, and it was funny how things like that just kind of again elevated Mark to the next level. But yeah, I think it was pretty clear with Mark and Matthew, they were going places. Same with Ronnie and John, from Scotland and England. They were special. They were special. I mean, I don't think you could have predicted. I don't think even they would have predicted what they're doing. I mean, the fact that I keep saying to people they can't go on forever, but I'm starting to wonder whether that's true.
It's funny you mentioned Mark making a break of 140, because I did hear a story from a later era. I don't know whether you've ever heard this, Neil, that Mark was practicing one day and he was on a maximum, and there was some old guy who'd been round snooker clubs all his life, had never witnessed a 147, was getting unbelievably excited, thought it was going to happen. Mark got down, made 140, perfect on the black, picked them up and racked them up for the next frame. Which, I don't know, even for Mark, that seems a little bit cruel, but I don't know whether it's true or not.
No. That sounds exactly like Mark. I think Neil,
yeah.
And I think the guy you're referring to is a guy called Viv, who Mark had an interesting practice kind of schedule at one point. He would just play this guy Viv, and he'd give Viv. I mean, Viv couldn't play by comparison, and Mark would give him 70, 80, 90, 100 start and just play. They'd play, and I think that was the story, that the 147, and I think he just did it for badness.
Yeah, okay. Actually, it does sound a lot like him on reflection. The thing about it is, though, we talked earlier, Wayne, about your dad being such a big star, but snooker in Britain on television in the 80s was so high profile. If you played even a few matches on TV or got to a big semi-final or something, that actually made you quite a big star. And I wonder what memories you guys have of some of the Welsh players who fell into that category. Tony Chappell is one, Steve Newbury. These were guys who were very well known at the time because they all had their moment in the spotlight.
Yeah, going back to the competitions we spoke to earlier, those were guys who would would come out and win, the matchroom events on a Sunday in a very difficult field. They went on to be professionals in their own right. I think I work with David Rowe now in Hong Kong, and Neil, again, maybe you can add to this, but he talked about Steve Newberry, such a heavy scorer. He used to be like, doing really well in pro-ams of the day, which were, again, very hard to win. Steve James, David Rowe, those are the kind of guys dominating the pro-ams then. But Steve Newberry, you might not have seen him as an exciting player with his glasses and everything, but I don't really remember him that well, Neil. Do you remember, the strength with Steve?
Not really, no. Steve was one that I didn't really kind of have much knowledge of. I think he's probably a little bit before my time in sort of competing in tournaments that he would have been in, and when I started, he would have been in the pro game. And I think one key thing is like back then, part of their God status, if they were professional, you saw much less of them. I think the professional players today are significantly more accessible to young players coming up. So yeah, Steve would have kind of gone under my radar a bit. I think the one player that we haven't talked much about, who probably falls into a in between category, Darren Morgan. I mean, Michael mentioned him, but Darren was sort of before the influx of the 1992, 1991 kind of classes. Got his pro ticket through the old Pontins pro ticket setup. Won the Welsh Amateur, which was obviously the big title. Went on to win the World Amateur title. So had proper pedigree going into the pro game, and obviously did really well. Probably doesn't get the acclaim that he feels he should have got, but he was probably within, I guess, similar to Terry, I suppose. Darren, one of Darren's biggest issues was Hendry.
It's funny you should mention that, Neil, because one of my memories of Darren, he won the Irish Masters, beating Steve Davis in the final in 1996. The following year, he got to the final again and was due to play Stephen Hendry in the final the following day. And I remember talking to him just after his semi-final, and he said, if I win this final, I will have beaten the two greatest players of all time, which they certainly were at the time, in major finals. And you could see that he thought, if I can do that, that will really make it all worthwhile. And he was one ball away from doing it. Stephen beat him on the final black. So that's my memory of Darren.
Yeah, which kind of speaks volumes, doesn't it? I mean, if you get into finals and taking Hendry at that time to the final black, you could definitely play the game.
Well, Wayne, it also goes back to the strength in depth, as you're talking about Darren Morgan, Steve Newberry, Tony Chappell, Wayne Joe. The names, Michael, going back to your original reason for this podcast, there were just so many good players.
Yeah, Tony Chappell, actually, now that I think of it, played Steve Davis in the British Open when Steve was at the height of his fame. And it was the strangest tournament ever, because the early rounds were best of 11. And I think Tony led Steve 5-4. Now, if you beat Steve Davis at that time in a ranking event, it was front page news. Steve came back to beat him 6-5. But bizarrely, the later rounds were actually best of 9. So he had been best of 9 right from the start. I think it was something to do with what the TV wanted. So I think that was a hard luck story for him. But he did go on to beat Steve in a big ranking event not long after that. But Wayne, tell us about where you are now, because you're still very much involved in the game. How on earth did you wind up in Hong Kong coaching the young talent there?
I'd gone back to the club sort of 2003, Dad's club, 2004. Got involved in the club. It was lovely to work with Dad for those 6 or 7 years. The smoking ban, as Neil will also be aware, did for a lot of clubs. It affected the business a lot. So there was a time then sort of coming up towards 2008, 2009, where maybe the business wasn't doing so well and maybe couldn't support me and Dad in the business. So I started looking around, and just by chance, I went on holiday to Hong Kong. I think it was in 2004. And I'd met a referee there. Just had a game of snooker introduced by Janie Watkins, who Neil will know, and Michael, you'll know from the old Global Snooker Centre days. And it just spawned from there, really. They were looking for a coach in 2010. There was a bit of internal politics, and you know, they were looking for it was a change, and they were looking for a new coach. And I was just from that chance meeting in 2004, my name popped into the hat. I was lucky enough to be pulled over for an interview in 2010. I got the job, and yeah, I've been there for 14 years now.
And Neil, you never went away from the game even after your playing career ended, and you're still very much involved now, aren't you?
Yeah, I've like you said, I've kind of been in or around for most of it. I did have a kind of sabbatical, I suppose. When I finished playing in '98, I started working with Terry at the WPBSA in a kind of coaching role, supporting him, setting up the coaching scheme. Worked within that role. I kind of worked on the young players of distinction, so had the kind of opportunity to work with again some of the guys that are still there now. I mean, Ryan Day was one of them. And we haven't touched on him in this, so you know, he's another one that kind of goes into the list, the endless list of talent. And then did various bits and pieces. I did have a breakaway. I went back to university in 2011, which was kind of a bit of a box ticking exercise for me. I always wanted, or always felt like I could do that. It was interesting going back to, you know, when I was in school. The career as advisor, kind of what do you want to be? I want to be a snooker player. That's not a career. What do you actually want to be? I want to be a snooker player. No, you got to do A levels. You got to do university. But everybody in snooker was kind of saying, no, you've got to get out. You've got to leave school. You've got to focus 100% on snooker. And nobody ever said, why don't you try and do both? Why don't you do both? When you and you know, you look at other sports, and lots of other successful sports people combine the kind of academic route with the competitive stuff. But so yeah, I went back to uni. I did a master's in 2011, 2012, and then ended up getting a job with Sport Radar, who was the data partner for World Snooker back in 15. So spent 4 years out on the circuit, going to all the tournaments. I was in China 50 odd days a year, and through that sort of had various conversations with Jason Ferguson, and ended up back at the WPBSA in 2019, and now running the WPBSA Players, which is effectively the Players Association.
And Wayne, we'll come back to you to finish, because I want to talk about your dad. And I think it was when I met you at an event in America last summer, I was talking to you about the memories of Terry that people in the game have. I can honestly say I can't think of anyone who's been involved in the game in any capacity who's got so much respect and admiration. I've never heard a single bad word said about him, and any dealings I had with your dad, Wayne, were always so pleasant and so positive. He's a bit of a Ken Doherty figure, the way Ken would be regarded in the game now, just that universal respect and admiration. Terry had that, and I hope, Wayne, your family is very aware of just how high regard Terry's still held in by everyone who's known him.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. I think it was in Lugo, Spain. We met.
Oh, was that where it was?
In one of the pool events. Yeah,
yeah.
And your kind words, which you just echoed there about you know, nobody having a bad word to say about Dad. I mean, it's quite well known that he's not very well at the moment. You know, he's got some dementia, so he's not the person he was, unfortunately. But he's still with us and watching the snooker. And everybody I speak to, of course, I'm sure people are not going to maybe say nothing if they have something bad to say. But generally, to echo your words again, everybody seems to speak well of him. You know, there are genuinely people who don't have a bad word to say, which just, you know, I've always been proud of him and his achievements. But when I hear people talking like you kindly spoke there, yeah, it makes us, my family, myself, all very proud of Dad.
Well, I think that's a good place to finish. And, you know, there's always something special, I feel, when 2 or 3 people who are steeped in the game for their whole life get together and just chat about snooker and share their memories from over the years. It's been wonderful to be part of that with you guys. Neil Tomkins, Wayne Griffiths, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of the WPBSA Official Podcast. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.